In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you why Great Hammers are the best weapon in Elden Ring. This is the 20th video in a series of videos where we showcase each weapon from a given weapon category in Elden Ring and go through the pros and cons of that weapon to help you make better decisions about whether you want to use that weapon or not in your build. But first, before we get into the Great Hammers themselves, let's take a look at the pros and cons of this weapon group, as well as the playstyles that I think most people who use Great Hammers will be using. So starting with the pros of Great Hammers first, the first thing is quite obvious. This weapon type has the highest stance damage of any weapon type in the game except for colossal weapons that are also hammers. So if you're trying to do stance breaks on enemies, this is one of the, if not the easiest weapon type to do this with. And there are certain Ashes of War and weapon skills in the game that will actually do more stance damage when using this weapon type if you use them, making it very, very good for this playstyle. A lot of these weapons can be acquired quite easily and early on in the game, or at least in the first half, giving you a broad selection of Great Hammers to use compared to some other weapons in the game. The two-handed light attacks of Great Hammers is actually faster than you would think, and it allows you to kind of make enemies flinch by hitting them repeatedly and also build up stance damage on them. And I think it's much faster than you would initially realize if you were looking at this weapon type. And lastly, strike damage is a useful damage type against some of the most annoying enemies in the game. If you're fighting like the gargoyles, it's a good damage type. Some of the enemies where you hit them and their hardness is so much, your weapon normally rebuffs off of them, like the crystallines, stuff like that. So there is a good place for strike damage in this game, and Great Hammers do that damage type. The cons of this weapon type are that even though it attacks faster with its two-handed moveset than you would think, it still attacks generally slower than many weapon types in the game. And additionally, only 2 Great Hammers have native status effect buildup on them out of the 14, so if you're trying to play a status effect build, your options are kind of limited. And lastly, they tend to be somewhat heavy, and even though they're not that heavy compared to some of the colossal weapons in the game, they are still heavier than the majority of weapons in the game, making them particularly difficult to use early on and manage your weight without fat rolling. So talking about the playstyles that most people using Great Hammers will use, I think there's really predominantly 2 ways people will play. The first is simply just two-handing a Great Hammer and going to town with it, predominantly because if you're playing it earlier on in the game, this allows you to manage your weight more effectively, and because a single charged R2 from a Great Hammer will stagger most enemies, and 2 of them will knock down most bosses, and if you block counter, you do very high stance damage as well, so you could theoretically do a charged R2, block counter, and knock down a boss, most bosses. So there isn't really a need to do anything else when that can be your strategy. And the second way is just because there are a bunch of faith scaling Great Hammers in this game, particularly the unique ones, pairing it with a Sacred Seal and buffing yourself, or using something like the Clawmark Seal and pumping strength and faith and throwing incantations while also two-handing a Great Hammer makes a lot of sense. You could use a Great Shield with a Great Hammer if you want. The problem with that is that it takes a lot of endurance in order to use both of these things and not fat roll all over the place if you have decent armor. So it's very, very difficult to do. So I think most people are just going to play with one single weapon, or a single weapon and a Sacred Seal. So those things out of the way, let's take a look at the unique Great Hammers first, and the first one up is the Envoy's Longhorn. The Envoy's Longhorn shares the default moveset of most Great Hammers and deals physical and holy damage. It has an average weight for a Great Hammer in Elden Ring, weighing 9.5, and requires 22 strength, 11 dexterity, and 18 faith in order to use effectively. The Envoy's Longhorn is a decent Great Hammer. It's one of the longer Great Hammers in Elden Ring, and its weapon skill Bubble Shower deals a metric ton of damage. However, you won't get it until pretty far into the game, and holy damage is resisted by many tough bosses, and it can take a long time to farm this weapon. Bubble Shower deals 100% holy damage, allowing you to buff it easily with Sacred Scorpion Charm and Holy Shroud and Cracktear, as well as using something like Warrior Jar Shard or Shard of Alexander. Note that the Envoy Crown Helmet will also buff the damage of this weapon skill, so consider using it if you're using this weapon. And keep in mind that this weapon skill does 92 stance damage if all bubbles hit your target, which is very hard to do, but still, that is a staggering amount of stance damage. Bubble Shower can one-shot tough-to-kill enemies and make short work of bosses, but it can be difficult to use because of its somewhat long windup and short range. This makes using it in succession risky since you'll likely be hit, because you need to be pretty close to ensure that the bubbles hit the target. However, if you do stance break an enemy, you can use this point blank into them for lots of damage. And keep in mind, you can use the Carrion Filigreed Crest in order to reduce the cost of this skill from 16 to 12, which makes it easier to use. The sweet spot for this weapon is about 50 strength, 50 faith, and 50 dexterity, which you won't reach until New Game Plus, making this an excellent Journey 2 weapon. However, strength and faith do scale better than dexterity, with faith slightly outperforming strength by a very small amount, and faith does affect bubble shower damage, while strength and dexterity do not. I recommend two-handing this weapon and pumping strength and faith and using it with a Clawmark Seal to cast incantations effectively. There is no need to use a Great Shield with this weapon, but you can if you really insist. Next up is the Cranial Vessel Candlestick. The Cranial Vessel Candlestick shares the default moveset of most Great Hammers and deals physical and fire damage. It's tied for the heaviest Great Hammer in Elden Ring, weighing 12.5, and requires 26 strength, 8 dexterity, and 22 faith in order to use effectively. The Cranial Vessel Candlestick is a phenomenal Great Hammer. It's the second longest Great Hammer in Elden Ring, it has very high attack rating for a Great Hammer, and its weapon skill, Surge of Faith, deals a ton of damage if you can land it. However, it is tied for the heaviest Great Hammer, and you cannot find it until close to the end of the game. Surge of Faith deals a lot of fire damage in an AoE around you that has a somewhat small radius, and then rains fireballs down from the sky, and you can continue to rain them down with repeated inputs, but the AoE is only produced on the first input and is the vast majority of the damage of this weapon's skill. Since Surge of Faith deals 100% fire damage, you can buff it easily with Fire Scorpion Charm and Fire Shroud and Crack Tier, as well as Warrior Jar Shard or Shard of Alexander. The sweet spot for this weapon is around 50 strength and 50 faith, with faith outperforming strength by a small amount. Dexterity doesn't scale well with this weapon, so you'll likely continue to increase faith and strength into New Game Plus. Note that faith increases Surge of Faith damage and that strength and dexterity do not. I recommend two-handing this weapon and pumping strength and faith and using it with a Clawmark Seal to cast incantations effectively, and this weapon makes a great candidate for Flame Grant Me Strength, since it deals both physical and fire damage. You can reach nearly 1600 attack rating when fully buffed while two-handing with this weapon. Up next is the Beastclaw Greathammer. The Beastclaw Greathammer shares the default moveset of most Greathammers and deals physical and holy damage. It's one of the lightest Greathammers in Elden Ring, weighing 9 and requires 20 strength, 10 dexterity, and 18 faith in order to use effectively. The Beastclaw Greathammer might be my favorite Greathammer in Elden Ring. Despite lower attack rating than many Greathammers, the fact that it does some holy damage, and despite the fact you can't get it until very far into the game, I just love its weapon skill Regal Beastclaw, which does 100% physical damage, and I appreciate that strength, dexterity, and faith all increase Regal Beastclaw damage. Regal Beastclaw does a cone-shaped AoE, not unlike the Beastclaw incantation, but it does more damage and it does hit in a wider cone, though the claws don't travel as far as its spell counterpart. The damage Regal Beastclaw deals is somewhat modest, but it's nearly impossible not to hit the target with it, and because it deals only physical damage, you can boost its damage with Flame Grant Me Strength effectively. The sweet spot for this weapon is around 50 strength and 50 dexterity with minimum requirements in faith. However, since you have 18 faith in order to use this weapon effectively anyway, you might as well take it up to 25 in order to use Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength. I suggest taking faith up to 50 after strength and dexterity, and then continuing with strength and dexterity in New Game Plus. And as I mentioned, all three of these stats increase the damage of Regal Beastclaw. I like to two-hand this weapon only using a seal for the buffing spells I mentioned leading into the Ash of War and using Warrior Jar Shard or Shard of Alexander to increase its damage further. Consider using Carrion Filigreed Crest to reduce its FP cost from 20 to 15 as well. And the last unique Greathammer is the Devourer Scepter. The Devourer Scepter shares the default moveset of most Greathammers and deals physical and fire damage. It's one of the heaviest Greathammers in Elden Ring, weighing 11.5 and requires 24 strength, 20 dexterity, and 25 faith in order to use effectively. The Devourer Scepter might be the longest Greathammer in Elden Ring, and you might be able to acquire it rather early on, but it's certainly not the best Greathammer. Not only is it very heavy and has the highest stat requirements of all Greathammers, but its weapon skill costs a ton of FP and does very poor damage. Devourer of Worlds does 100% fire damage in a medium-ish AoE and heals you for 15% of your max HP for each enemy hit, which sounds great, right? Well, it does very poor damage, and I mean very poor, and because it costs 35 FP, you can't use it very often. Even when optimized to get the most out of this weapon's skill, buffed with Flame Grant Me Strength, Golden Vow, Fire Shroud and Crack Tier, Shard of Alexander, Fire Scorpion Charm, and Ritual Sword Talisman, I could not break 1k damage on any enemy hit. However, it's not bad if you're using Mimic Tier, as it keeps them alive easily. The sweet spot for this weapon is at 50 strength and 50 dexterity with minimum points in faith, which happens to be 25, allowing you to cast Flame Grant Me Strength and Golden Vow. This makes this weapon more of a quality weapon than a strength faith weapon, like some of the previous unique Greathammers. And only faith boosts the damage of Devourer of Worlds, making things worse. I highly recommend using a seal to buff with Flame Grant Me Strength and Golden Vow, especially since this weapon does both fire and physical damage, and leaning into two-handing this weapon with jump attacks and the Claw Talisman for more damage. However, another great option is to use it with the Great Shield and use some sort of Ash of War on that Great Shield that you prefer, since the one on this weapon is pretty bad, or you could use something like the Jellyfish Shield to further boost your damage when attacking with this weapon. And this brings us to the infusible Great Hammers in Elden Ring, and first up is the Large Club. The Large Club shares the default moveset of most Great Hammers and deals physical damage. It's tied for lightest Great Hammer in Elden Ring, weighing 8.5, and requires 22 strength in order to use effectively. The Large Club is a good option for those wanting to use a Great Hammer right away, since you can acquire it in the first 5 minutes of the game in Limgrave. It's also tied for the lightest Great Hammer in Elden Ring and makes it easier to use early on, and it's the third longest Great Hammer. The downside is that its attack rating is rather low for a Great Hammer. Barbaric Roar is not a terrible Ash of War, and changes the charged heavy attack of the weapon into a combo that can be used quite effectively while also boosting physical damage and strength scaling. It's not the greatest Ash of War, since you need good poise and protection as you typically trade damage, but there are worse out there. I suggest changing this when you can to something like Stormcaller, Stamp Upward Cut, Stamp Sweep, or Lion's Claw. Both Stamp Upward Cut and Lion's Claw do 42 stance damage when used with Great Hammers, allowing you to stance break many bosses in 2 hits. Infusion-wise, Fire and Lightning and Magic are virtually tied for highest attack rating, with Sacred and Flame Art coming in second. Heavy is a bit behind that, and Cold is not far behind Heavy. Stamp Sweep works well with the Blood Infusion, so consider it if you want to take advantage of Hemorrhage. You can either two-hand this weapon or use it with a Great Shield when you get one, though you can still block counter with this weapon in a pinch. Up next is the Curved Great Club. The Curved Great Club shares the default moveset of most Great Hammers and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a Great Hammer in Elden Ring, weighing 10, and requires 24 strength and 10 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Curved Great Club is the pound-for-pound king of infusible Great Hammers. It has the highest attack rating of them all, except when set to Heavy or Cold, and you can acquire it pretty early on by farming and learning of the lakes, and it's one of the longer Great Hammers in Elden Ring. And what's amazing is that it's not even the heaviest Great Hammer. Like the Large Club, this weapon also comes with Barbaric Roar, which you can leave on it or you can change for something else. I really like Flaming Strike on this weapon because it has the highest Flame Art attack rating of all infusible Great Hammers, allowing you to make a solid Faith build with it, and two-handed only for 16 strength. Infusion-wise, Fire and Lightning is in first place with 819 attack rating, with Magic in second at 799 and Sacred and Flame Art coming in third at 792. Heavy and Cold are much further behind, and I recommend using a different Great Hammer if you like these infusions, as there are several that have S scaling in strength. I like to two-hand this weapon with a Sacred Seal, setting it to the Flame Art or Sacred Infusion, meeting the 16th strength in order to two-hand it, and then cranking Faith sky high in order to be able to cast incantations with the Erdtree Seal, and still have fantastic melee damage, with a weapon that also has very good stance damage. Up next is the Great Mace. The Great Mace shares the default moveset of most Great Hammers and deals physical damage. It's one of the heaviest Great Hammers in Elden Ring, weighing 11.5, and requires 28 points in strength in order to use effectively. The Great Mace slaps hard and is an excellent Great Hammer. It has very high attack rating for a Great Hammer, it's longer than most other Great Hammers, and you can find it reasonably quickly if you know where to go, and it has fantastic heavy scaling. The only downside is that it's pretty heavy for a Great Hammer. Endure is an excellent weapon skill that increases your damage absorption by 45% and increases your poise for 3 seconds, allowing you to tank damage and not be interrupted while you take advantage of Great Hammer charged heavy attacks that can stance break most bosses in 2 hits. You can, however, change it to another if you wish. Infusion-wise, Fire and Lightning and Magic are virtually tied for highest attack rating, with Sacred and Flame Art coming in second, though Heavy is not far behind thanks to the weapon's fantastic heavy scaling. Cold is also pretty good at 738 attack rating. Like other Great Hammers, you don't really need to do anything but two-hand this weapon to get the most out of it, using Endure when you need to stance break a tough enemy and relying on jump attacks or R1s as needed. Or you can swap to a more offensive Ash of War and use that instead, but you will still play somewhat similarly. Up next is the Pickaxe. The Pickaxe has a unique overhead heavy attack similar to the Great Club, which is a colossal weapon, and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a Great Hammer in Elden Ring, weighing 10, and requires 22 strength and 10 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Pickaxe is an interesting Great Hammer that functions more like a Great Axe than a Great Hammer, and in fact cannot be power stanced with other Great Hammers, only other Great Axes. It also does pierce damage, much like the Rusted Anchor, allowing it to deal counter damage as well as take advantage of the Spear Talisman to further boost counter damage. You can farm it from miners in Limgrave Tunnel very early on in the game, and the only real negative is that it's kind of short for a Great Hammer. Endure is not a bad weapon skill, and you can certainly use it with this weapon, or you can change it for something else depending on what you like. Infusion-wise, Fire and Lightning comes in first at 794, with Magic at 783, and Sacred and Flame Art in third at 770. Heavy is not bad at 723, and Cold is 690. This puts it in the middle of the pack damage-wise. I like to dual-wield this weapon with a Rusted Anger, using jump attacks and L1 chains to destroy enemies, taking advantage of counter damage when enemies are attacking. Use the Spear and Claw talismans, and make sure to have good poise so you aren't interrupted. Additionally, set your infusion to heavy to get the most from the Spear talisman, since it only boosts physical counter damage. Next, we come to the Brick Hammer. The Brick Hammer shares the default moveset of most Great Hammers and deals physical damage. It's tied for the heaviest Great Hammer in Elden Ring, weighing 12.5, and requires 31 points in strength in order to use effectively. The Brick Hammer hits like an absolute truck. It not only has the second highest attack rating of all infusible Great Hammers and phenomenal strength scaling, you can find it very early on in Stormveil Castle, making it a great choice for would-be Great Hammer users. The only negatives are that it's the second shortest Great Hammer, and also the heaviest. Barbaric Roar, its weapon skill, buffs physical damage and strength scaling, while also changing the charged heavy attack of the weapon to an attack chain for 40 seconds. You can further boost the charged heavy attack damage of this chain by equipping the Roar Medallion, Highland Axe in your offhand, and by using the Spiked Crack Tier. This is not a bad weapon skill, especially using the heavy infusion, but you could also use Stamp Upward Cut, Stamp Sweep, or Lion's Claw. Infusion-wise, Fire and Lightning comes in first at a huge 809 attack rating, with Magic behind in second at 782, and Sacred and Flame Art in third at 777. Heavy performs very well though at 757, and Cold is just behind at 740, making it a valid option. I like to two-hand this weapon using jump attacks, charged heavy attacks, and whatever weapon skill that you decide to use. Up next is the Battle Hammer. The Battle Hammer shares the default moveset of most Great Hammers and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a Great Hammer in Elden Ring, weighing 10, and requires 26 strength and 8 dexterity in order to use effectively. The attack rating of the Battle Hammer is unquestionably solid, and it has fantastic strength scaling. However, it's probably unlikely you will use this weapon if you're using a Great Hammer. And that's because it's not only the shortest hammer in Elden Ring, but also because the earliest you can get it is in the Lendel Royal Capital, which is quite far into the game, and it can take some time to farm it. You'll likely have a better Great Hammer that's already upgraded by this point. Braggart's Roar is not a bad weapon skill and boosts physical damage by 10%, adds 10% damage negation to all types, and boosts stamina recovery by about 20%. It also changes your charged heavy attack into a running powerful attack that is identical to Warcry. You can further boost the charged heavy attack damage in the same ways the Brick Hammer can. However, you might want to swap it if you don't like this weapon skill. Infusion-wise, Magic and Fire and Lightning are virtually tied for highest attack rating, with Sacred and Flame Art coming in second. Heavy is not bad, as I mentioned, and Cold is just behind Heavy as another viable option. I recommend two-handing this weapon and using a weapon skill like Lion's Claw if you insist on using this weapon. Next, we come to the Rotten Battle Hammer. The Rotten Battle Hammer shares the default moveset of most Great Hammers and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a Great Hammer in Elden Ring, weighing 10, and requires 26 strength and 8 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Rotten Battle Hammer is nearly identical to the Battle Hammer in every way, except that it does about 5% less damage and has Scarlet Rot buildup on hit. However, you can't find this weapon until even further in Elden Ring in the Consecrated Snowfield, making it practically a New Game Plus weapon. I like to use this weapon with either the Poison Mist weapon skill with the Blood Infusion in order to be able to set Scarlet Rot, Hemorrhage, and Poison while buffed with Poison Mist. Or you can use something like Stormcaller with either Poison or Blood Infusions to hit rapidly, triggering these status effects. Consider using Lord of Blood's Exaltation and Kindred of Rot's Exaltation with this weapon for increased attack power, and or the White Mask or Mushroom Crown. Next we come to the Celebrant's Skull. The Celebrant's Skull shares the default moveset of most Great Hammers and deals physical damage. It is tied for the lightest Great Hammer in Elden Ring, weighing 8.5, and requires 18 strength and 12 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Celebrant's Skull might not seem like a good weapon. It has lower attack rating than many Great Hammers, it's quite short for a Great Hammer, and you cannot find it until Altus Plateau. However, it is tied for the lightest Great Hammer, and it grants 20 runes per hit and has extremely low requirements. Barbaric Roar is not a bad weapon skill, but because this weapon is both short and deals less damage than most Great Hammers, I like to use something like Lion's Claw and lean into the stance damage of the weapon. Infusion-wise, Fire and Lightning comes in first at 777, with Magic in second at 758, and Sacred and Flame Art in a close third at 750. I like to use Fire to get the highest attack rating possible with this weapon and still maintain decent strength scaling in order to use a Great Shield. I like to pair this weapon with a Great Shield for block counters, which is much easier to do because it's so light compared to other Great Hammers. This allows you to use Lion's Claw and block counter to stance break bosses quickly and plays somewhat similarly to my Tower Knight build. Up next is Great Stars. The Great Stars shares the default moveset of most Great Hammers and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a Great Hammer in Elden Ring weighing 10 and requires 22 strength and 12 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Great Stars is a fan favorite for a reason, and that's because it's the only Great Hammer with native bleed buildup, and it also heals 1% max HP per hit with the weapon. Otherwise, though, its damage is in the middle of the pack for Great Hammers as is its length, and you cannot find it until Altus Plateau, which might take you a while to get to. Endure is not a bad weapon skill, but I prefer something that hits more rapidly to take advantage of both the bleed buildup and healing per hit. Stormcaller is a great choice for this, as is Prelate's Charge. Infusion-wise, Fire and Lightning take the top spot at 779, with Magic at 765 and Sacred and Flameheart at 753. Heavy is at 723, with Occult a ways behind at 655, but much higher than Blood and Poison, which is 570. This makes Occult a decent alternative to Blood if you want higher bleed buildup, but don't want to sacrifice quite as much attack rating. I like to use this weapon with the Occult scaling and Stormcaller to trigger Hemorrhage on hard-to-kill enemies and bosses, also healing you at the same time. Make sure you have high poise so you're not interrupted, and use things like Lord of Blood's Exaltation and Rotten Winged Sword Insignia to boost attack power further. Note that you can also use the Dragon Communion Seal to cast spells if you are set up this way, and you can drop some points into Faith, but it is a rather difficult stat spread needing Strength, Endurance, Faith, Arcane, and some Mind. And lastly, we come to the Greathorn Hammer. The Greathorn Hammer shares the default moveset of most Great Hammers and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a Great Hammer in Elden Ring weighing 10 and requires 22 strength and 10 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Greathorn Hammer is a vastly underrated weapon. Although its damage and length are in the middle of the pack for Great Hammers, it can be farmed pretty early in the game, and the 3% max HP healing per kill can be invaluable early on. And since you usually kill things in 1 or 2 hits with it, it typically performs better than Great Stars in terms of healing while exploring the world of Elden Ring. Barbaric Roar is not a bad weapon skill, so you can use this or any other weapon skill you like. I like Royal Knight's Resolve or Determination for easy kills with jump attacks or charged heavy attacks. Infusion-wise, Fire and Lightning comes in first at 789 with Magic at 776 and Sacred and Flameheart just behind at 775. Heavy is not bad at 726, but Cold actually has no intelligence scaling with this weapon for some reason, so I don't recommend selecting that infusion as quality actually outperforms it in terms of attack rating. I like to play this weapon as a mage build using the Magic Infusion and Cranking Intelligence. You can two-hand this weapon somewhat easily with 15 strength, but 22 strength is not a lot in order to be able to single-hand it either. This allows you to cast spells effectively while still maintaining high melee damage, and you can take advantage of Ritual Sword Talisman easily since you still gain the HP back when killing enemies with spells. If you use Assassin's Cerulean Dagger, then you can get your FP back when you stance break enemies, and then cast spells to get your HP back, rinse and repeat. So that wraps up our video on how Great Hammers are the best weapon in Elden Ring. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's been a while since I've done one of these. Really love the Great Hammer weapon class, and I look forward to getting the rest of these wrapped up before the DLC, so you can expect a lot more Elden Ring content in the near future. What's your go-to Great Hammer? Did you learn something in this video? Let me know in the comments below.